Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man! Order. Urgent question. Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Secretary of State make a statement on the government's analysis of the long-term economic impact of Brexit upon the economy?
Minister Steve Baker.
Mr. Speaker, I begin by setting out our approach to publishing economic analysis, I hope once and for all. I can confirm that when we bring forward, I think the honourable gentleman will want to listen to this, I can confirm that when we bring forward the vote on the final deal that we agree with the European Union, we will ensure that this House is presented with the appropriate analysis the government has done so that the House can make an informed decision. But I think all members of this House must surely agree that the government cannot be expected to put such analysis into the public domain before that analysis has been completed. That would misrepresent our views, Mr. Speaker. Furthermore, the government cannot be expected to publish that analysis while the negotiations continue, which would surely harm the national interest. Parliament has rightfully agreed that ministers have a duty not to publish anything that could risk exposing our negotiating position. Now, let me turn to the article which has prompted this question. The article is a selective interpretation of a preliminary analysis. It is an attempt to undermine our exit from the European Union. As I've told the House before, the government is undertaking a wide range of analysis on our exit from the EU. The next stage of this analysis, summarised in a draft paper brought together for ministers this month, has been a cross-Whitehall effort to support our negotiating priorities. It has not been led by my department. It is not yet anywhere near being approved by ministers. Even the ministerial team in my department has only just been consulted on this paper in recent days, and we've made it clear that it requires significant further work. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I only saw this report myself this morning. The analysis to which I believe this article refers is a preliminary attempt to improve on the flawed analysis around the EU referendum. It is there to test ideas and to design a viable framework for the analysis of our exit from the EU. At this early stage, it only considers off-the-shelf trade arrangements that currently exist. We have been clear that these are not what we are seeking in the negotiations. It does not yet consider our desired outcome, the most ambitious relationship possible with the European Union, as set out by the Prime Minister in her Florence speech. Such an agreement, Mr. Speaker, is in the interests of both the UK and the EU. Therefore, the scenarios in this analysis continue to suffer from the flaws we've seen in previous analysis of this type. These sorts of analysis have been proved to be wrong in the wake of the referendum, not least because there is huge uncertainty around any forecast, especially in the long run and especially in the context of a major strategic choice. It is the government's job to improve on this analysis, but to do so we first have to understand where previously it went wrong. That is what the analysis to which this article refers is. It's not a forecast for our preferred outcome of the negotiations. It does not yet properly take account of the opportunities of leaving the EU. Finally, Mr. Speaker, on the 23rd of June 2016, the people of this country took a decision to leave the European Union in the context of a wide range of economic information. The purpose of this analysis is not to question that decision, which this House voted overwhelmingly to uphold. I hope all members of this House will agree that we should continue to respect the result of the referendum.
Sir Keir Starmer.
Not good enough. Here we go again, Mr. Speaker. Brexit impact assessments, take two. For the past year, we've called on the government to publish Brexit impact assessment. A simple argument. On decisions of this significance, Parliament is entitled to know the likely impact of the government's approach to Brexit and thus to hold the government to account. The government has refused repeatedly our requests. Last year, the Secretary of State initially insisted that these reports existed in excruciating detail. But they were so sensitive that nobody else could see them. After this House passed a binding humble address, the Secretary of State changed tack, telling the Brexit Select Committee just last month that no economic forecast of outcome had ever existed. Last night we learned that an analysis has been produced after all. This is now piling absurdity upon absurdity. And there's some pretty obvious questions, Mr. Speaker. When was this new analysis commissioned? In particular, was it before or after the Secretary of State gave evidence to the Brexit Select Committee last month on this issue? Is this the only report that's been prepared on the Brexit scenarios? If not, what other analysis has been done? Does this new analysis model the government's Brexit approach? If not, why not? If so, will it lead to changes in government policy? Finally, and most importantly, will the Secretary of State now publish this now? Not in 9 months, but now, so that we can hold the government properly to account. Mr. Speaker, we've been here before. It took a great deal of time last year and the use of a humble address to force the government to release documents relating to Brexit. The Secretary of State has a chance today to avoid a repeat of that exercise if he commits to publishing this new analysis in full. Will he do so?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman raises impact assessments, and what I can say to the House is we've always been absolutely clear that we have a wide range of programme of analysis which is evolving continually. But this economic analysis is not what is formally known as an impact assessment. But what I would say to the House, Mr. Speaker, what I would say to the House, Mr. Speaker, is that the right on...
Order! Excessive gesticulation by a number of members, which is unseemly and certainly unstatesmanlike. Let's hear from the fella. Steve Baker.
What the Right Honourable Gentleman does and what the party opposite does is completely neglect our duty to safeguard the national interest in the course of these negotiations. I can understand, Mr. Speaker, why the Right Honourable Gentleman and those behind him would want the reports in the press to be accurate. Fundamentally, they don't wish to leave the European Union. For them, Mr. Speaker, and for him, good news is a disaster and bad news is a welcome confirmation of their worldview. They await each set of employment figures with eager anticipation, only to have their hopes dashed when every set shows an ever-increasing number of people in work. They gleefully celebrate warnings from banks about the possibility of jobs moving to the continent. Then they have to retreat when a few months later they assert the supremacy of the City of London. I don't blame them, Mr. Speaker. They care passionately about remaining in the European Union and they want to overturn the result. But their strategy is becoming clear, Mr. Speaker: demoralisation, delay and revocation. Mr. Speaker, that is not what our parties stood for at the last election. Our parties were clear. Our parties were clear that we would respect the result of the referendum, and that requires the government to deliver the best possible Brexit. And that is what we are trying to do. As I said in the opening words of my reply, when the time comes for a meaningful vote, the government will ensure that the House is appropriately informed. But what I will say to the House is that we can see what some of these economic forecasts, what some of this analysis can be worth. Take, for example, the respective Bank of England. What institution could be more respected for its analysis? But in August 2016, they made a quantitative forecast of the impact of Brexit. What did they say? They said that exports would go down by 0.5%, but they went up by 8.3%. They said business investment would go down by 2%. It went up by 1.7%. They said housing investment would go down by 4.75%. It went up by 5%. It said employment growth would be zero, flat. It went up to a new all-time high. Mr. Speaker, the public deserves to see the national interest protected in these negotiations. The public deserves to have a House of Commons of representatives who exhibit a healthy scepticism about economic forecasting.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, it's perfectly obvious to everybody on both sides of the Channel that if the United Kingdom does leave the largest and richest multinational free trade area in the world and constructs new barriers by way of tariffs, customs or regulatory barriers between ourselves and that market, future generations will, to some degree or other, be poorer than they otherwise would be. Does the Minister not accept that the government should feel itself under a duty to have the best informed debate in this House and in the country on the possible consequences of likely scenarios now, when the government is deciding what its ultimate policy is going to be, and continuously throughout the vital 12 months that are coming when the final picture will start to emerge? And will he stop pretending that this has something to do with defending our negotiating position, or that somehow this is some perverse attempt to reverse the referendum, and accept that he's failed, actually, to try to protect the government from political embarrassment?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the public took a profoundly important strategic choice, and that choice was to leave the European Union. And that means what the government needs to do is to deliver free trade on a new basis, not on the basis of political integration, but on the basis of a new, deep and special partnership with the European Union. And it is the government's intention to deliver the best possible, the most frictionless trading with our friends in the European Union, which is it is in all of our mutual interests to do. He talks about our duty, and of course he knows well our duty. Our duty is to best look after the national interest of our constituents and of our country, and it is exactly that which we are seeking to do as we take these negotiations and this analysis forward.
Stephen Gethins.
Mr. Speaker, just yesterday I was commenting in this chamber that the only constant in the government's Brexit position is one of chaos and confusion. Now, far be it from me to get in the way of a government undermining itself or a Tory feuding. However, this counts, and bluff and bluster just doesn't cut it anymore. One thing that's striking about the figures that have been released is they're very similar to the Scottish Government figures that it produced on Scotland's place in Europe. If the Scottish Government can produce its figures, why can't this government?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can reassure the honourable gentleman that we are not copying the Scottish Government's analysis. We are working on our own. We are doing our own homework. But what I'd say to him is that it's very clear what the position of his party is. He wishes to break up the United Kingdom and have a Scotland within the European Union, and I think that it's within that context that the actions that he describes must be understood.
Mr. Philip Davis.
Speaker, we have here some London-centric Remoaners, which could be a way of describing the Shadow Secretary of State, who have, in the civil service, who didn't want us to leave the European Union in the first place and put together some dodgy figures to back up their case, who still don't want us to leave the European Union and are regurgitating some dodgy figures in order to try and reverse the result of the referendum. Does my honourable friend agree with that analysis? And does he agree that really, to that extent, this isn't any new story whatsoever?
Quite right.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes a point which is very much in line with his long-held views. I should say and reaffirm that I'm very proud of the officials with whom that I work and the commitment that they are demonstrating to delivering on the decision of the British people, irrespective of how they voted. But it is, of course, the intention of our current analysis to improve on what has gone before. And as I set out in my initial response, we do recognise that there were flaws in the previous approach.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. A lack of transparency is not in the national interest. On the 6th of December, I asked the Brexit Secretary, have the government undertaken any impact assessments on the implications of leaving the EU for different sectors of the economy? He replied, and I quote, not in sectors. Now we learn that, in fact, it has been done, and it is reported that chemicals, clothing, manufacturing, food and drink, cars and retail will be the hardest hit. Can the Minister offer the House an explanation for the discrepancy between what we were told and what we now, in fact, know?
Minister.
Speaker, as I've explained, we have always said that our economic analysis was continually evolving across a wide range of activities. Well, they laugh, Mr. Speaker. What else would they expect but for the government to continually work on this subject with a developing analysis? As I may not have said in my opening remarks, I know from asking him that the Secretary of State only saw this particular document last night. I saw it this morning, and I think that that will explain the answers which he has given.
Rachel McLean.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree with me that businesses up and down this country and in Redditch will wonder whose side the Labour Party are on when they take great pleasure in forecasts that are predicting doom and gloom? And they might certainly conclude that they're not on the side of the hard-working businesses and entrepreneurs in this country.
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think my honourable friend is exactly right, and I think people should. I think the vast majority of right-thinking people in the United Kingdom will expect that now that the decision has been taken, it should be carried through with a good heart as a matter of choice. But what I think we're seeing is time and time again foot-dragging reluctance by the party opposite, which increasingly be seen to be not respecting the choices of its own voters.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's reported that this analysis shows that the North Midlands and Northern Ireland are hardest hit by all of the scenarios. Can he confirm that that is because all of the scenarios, in fact, assume that Britain is outside the customs union? Can he confirm, too, that the government appears to have done no analysis of the different customs union options and the impact on our economy? And given how significant this is for northern manufacturing, for Northern Ireland, and also the points raised by the CBI, that this is irresponsible, letting northern manufacturers down, and will he commit to conduct this analysis and publish it before the customs bill completes its passage through Parliament?
Well, Mr. Speaker, Minister. I'm very grateful to the right honourable lady because she's given me the opportunity to reassure her that under all scenarios in this economic analysis, there is economic growth. The question only is to what extent, how fast. But in all of those scenarios, across a 15-year period, there is projected to be economic growth.
Sir Nicholas Soames.
Would my honourable friend understand that many businesses in my constituency are already very nervous about the apparently cavalier attitude of some Brexiteer opinion to their company's continued success? And will he therefore confirm that the government will seek to negotiate an arrangement to get a result which does not damage the long-term economic success of our country and the national interests of our people?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can give my honourable friend that assurance. The government is not cavalier. It's precisely because we take seriously our duties that we are continuing to develop our economic analysis. And of course, I can reassure him that we are seeking to establish a free trade agreement and other partnership arrangements which are of unprecedented scope and ambition.
Chris Leslie.
Speaker, for the Minister to basically use the excuse of not publishing this because he hasn't yet had a chance to edit it, twist it, distort it, redact the information within it, is a total and utter disgrace. It is a right of the public to know about their livelihoods and their future, and for the government not to publish this is deeply irresponsible and dishonest. This is a cover-up, Mr. Speaker, pure and simple, and it stinks.
Minister.
Well, I congratulate the honourable gentleman on going for the hardest possible hit that he can manage, but it's not good enough, Mr. Speaker, because the truth is that the honourable gentleman has made perfectly clear by his words and his actions that he does not accept the referendum result. It is perfectly clear that he is amongst those who wish to seek a revocation of the democratic decision of the British people, and he is acting in that spirit.
Sir Desmond Swayne.
As an antidote, will he read Professor Minford's work? Alternatively, he might just go to the cinema to see Darkest Hour.
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend, and I can confirm to him that, yes, I will read Professor Minford's work, and I can confirm that, as the Transparency Register will show, I have met Professor Minford, and I will continue to meet Professor Minford, and I will continue to look at the work of Economists for Free Trade.
Tom Brake.
Cabinet squabbles in the middle of these toughest negotiations, the Minister has no right to talk about the national interest. He must stop treating parliamentarians like chumps. He knows, we know, and this report confirms that Brexit is going to cause huge damage to British jobs and British families. Will the government, and indeed the Leader of the Opposition, now allow a vote on the deal so that the people can decide whether they want to pursue this very damaging approach, or whether in fact they want us to stay in the European Union?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman reminds me that I didn't answer my honourable friend's other point, which is I have been to see Darkest Hour, and the honourable gentleman does a good job of reminding me that some people do approach our current circumstances in an unnecessarily bleak spirit. What I would say to him once again is that the economic analysis is very clear that in all scenarios there is to be economic growth. And what I would say to him is I'd encourage him to go back to the report the Treasury Select Committee during the referendum campaign when I served on it, and to have a look at the abuse of figures that was documented in our report by the Remain campaign, because I would urge him not to repeat the abuse of figures which we catalogued in that report.
Antoinette Sandbach.
Mr. Speaker, it's clear that the car manufacturing sector, the chemicals sector and indeed the food sector, all vital sectors for my constituency in Edinburgh, will be adversely affected according to this analysis. Quite frankly, Minister, I take exception to being told that it's not in the national interest for me to see a report that allows me to best represent my constituents. Parliament needs access to the best possible information on which to base our decisions.
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've got great faith in my honourable friend, and of course we appreciate the importance of cars, chemical and food. And what I would say to her is, as I committed at the beginning of my response, when the time approaches for us to have a meaningful vote in Parliament, we will put before the House, before both Houses, appropriate economic analysis to assist the choices which the House makes. But I would also say to her that we're not expecting the European Union to transparently publish all of their analysis of the situation, and we do not propose to go into these negotiations having revealed all of our thinking.
Kate Hurley.
I wonder if the Minister thinks that perhaps the person who leaked this within the Whitehall establishment would be better off moving and working in Brussels. But could I ask the Minister, the methodology that was used for this report, whatever it is, was it the same methodology that said that if we didn't join the euro, the country would tank in terms of its financial future?
No, completely. Well, Minister, of course, in relation to who leaked this, of course, we are carrying out the usual inquiries. But what I would say to her is, of course, she's absolutely right. In the past, economic predictions have been very poor, and poor for good reasons, which I'd love to elaborate on another occasion. But what I would say is that I set out that particular critique of even the Bank of England's forecast, and she's absolutely right. We should have, as I said earlier on, a healthy scepticism.
Mr. Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I just point out to my honourable friend that we would be in a strange position if governments had to publish every bit of advice to ministers and analysis that they profoundly believe to be wrong. The last Labour government didn't do that, and he should resist publishing this if he believes it's not in the national interest to do so. And can I also advise him that there are people trying to divert the direction of this government off Brexit? There is absolutely no doubt about it. Can you look into why this particular document was leaked on this particular day, the day that the withdrawal bill has its first debate in the upper house?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend, the Chairman of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, makes an important and I think authoritative point about the conduct of government, and I think that members opposite would, if I may say so, do well to reflect on how they would wish to govern the country if, God forbid, the electorate should ever give them an opportunity to do so. But I think we do, all of us in this House, need to have an eye on the long-term functioning of our democracy and our constitution, and with that in mind, I do hear what my honourable friend says. There is clearly a campaign to overturn the referendum result. It can be seen at work in the media and in this House, and we will certainly bear in mind what he says.
Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister said that this cross-party analysis has not been coordinated by his department, but in this there would appear to be some confusion. Last week when I asked the Brexit Secretary, who gave evidence to the Select Committee, if his department was coordinating the cross-departmental work on the impact on sectors of no deal, he said yes. If there is indeed no deal, we would likely fall out on WTO rules. Could the Minister confirm that in one of the scenarios outlined in the report, the WTO option that is advocated by many on his side, that the impact of non-tariff barriers has the equivalent of a 10% tariff slapped across the economy?
Yeah. Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that was quite a long question. What I would say to her is that there are two particular scenarios in here which are not modelled at this stage in this particular analysis. One is the policy choices which the Prime Minister rightly set out in her Florence speech. Another is exiting in the unfortunate and we think unlikely circumstance of not reaching an agreement, and how one might take the right policy choices in the event of trading on WTO rules. But we will continue to take this analysis forward, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to the day when we're able to present it to the House, or present appropriate analysis to the House, before the meaningful vote is taken.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the Minister recalls, prior to the referendum, what became known as Project Fear. That everything was going to go wrong after the referendum if we voted to come out, sir. Something short of bubonic plague, but it didn't happen. But with those warnings, the British people still voted to come out. So what relevance is another forecast now of exactly the same as what Project Fear was in the first place?
Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes a very good point, and I well remember Project Fear in all its manifestations, and happily what most of us, I think, on the Leave side thought at the time, what we thought was that those horror predictions would not come to pass after the vote, and indeed we have been proven correct. And I should say, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the day when we continue to prove economists wrong when they make horror story predictions.
Ben Bradshaw.
But why, Mr. Speaker, has the government assessed the impact of all the scenarios, but not the one it says it wants, which is the fantasy cake and eat it one?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful for that question, because I can reassure him and the House that we will continue to develop and expand our economic analysis. We, of course, cannot control the timing of leaks, and were we to have chosen to publish an analysis, as we will as we approach the meaningful vote, then, of course, it would contain the relevant information. But as I say to the House, we can't control the timing of leaks.
Stephen Hammond.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is of course right that this analysis doesn't question the result of the referendum, nor does it model his desired scenario. But what it does show, of course, is that if you model a fully comprehensive free trade deal with the EU post-Brexit, combined with the benefits of new trade deals, there is a net effect on the economic growth that he's been talking about of 1.5%. Could he tell the House where he hopes a special and deep relationship will differ from a fully comprehensive free trade deal post-Brexit?
Well, I think my honourable friend may know that Michel Barnier did try to include financial services in the TTIP deal, and we believe that we can go beyond what has been agreed in the past. But I also say to him the analysis includes not a comprehensive and a deal of the scope that we would like to agree. It only includes an average based on past precedents. So we do believe that we can reasonably go further than we have before, and of course we're very well appraised of the importance of financial services and ensuring that the city flourishes.
Joanna Cherry.
Mr. Speaker, if the economic forecasts and the impact assessments published to date have been so wrong, why doesn't the government tell the British people what it is it wants from the EU by way of a deal, cost it and publish the results? Why is that so difficult?
Minister. Speaker, the Prime Minister, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has set out what we want in the Lancaster House speech and in the Florence speech, and we are heading down the path of successfully delivering on what the government has said we wish to have. And we will continue, she says cost it, Mr. Speaker, but we will continue to carry out a wide-ranging and developing programme of economic analysis which will help inform our negotiating position and our decisions.
Mr. William Ragg.
Speaker, could my honourable friend, the excellent Minister, name me a single civil service forecast, leaked or otherwise, that has been accurate?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no, I am not able to name an accurate forecast, and I think that they are always wrong and wrong for good reasons. And well, Mr. Speaker, they're chatting at me from a sedentary position. My long-standing views on the flaws in the epistemology of the social sciences and the consequences for econometrics are well set out in various forums. I'd encourage any member to go and have a look at them, and I'm happy to recommend a reading list.
Chukaramuna.
Mr. Speaker, they are not protecting the interests of the British people. They are withholding information from them. He keeps invoking the referendum, but of course that did not give us any indication as to the form of Brexit that the public wish us to follow. Will he confirm that what this analysis shows is that the least worst option, which is staying in the single market and the customs union, has actually been taken off the table voluntarily by the Prime Minister with no mandate whatsoever?
Mr. Speaker, I would encourage members of the House to go and Google on the Sun website for the Honourable Gentleman's name during the course of the referendum, and they will find a wonderful picture of him standing next to a poster proclaiming that the Leave campaign wanted to leave the single market. He made the point at the time, Mr. Speaker. He certainly did, Mr. Speaker. Anyone can go and find it on the Sun's website. I mean, the point was made at the time, Mr. Speaker, and the public chose, and it will not be possible to honour the decision of the British people if we allow the European Union to set the UK's tariffs, and if we become people in a political purgatory of perpetual rule-taking from the European Union without any democratic say. It is the desire of this government that our country should continue to be a democracy, and for that reason we will leave the EEA and the customs union.
David Jones.
My honourable friend agree that our experience post-referendum illustrates the danger of publishing incomplete and inchoate economic analyses. We were told prior to the referendum by the Treasury that if we voted to leave we would enter immediate recession. The IMF told us that the economy would contract by as much as 9.5%. Both were made to look extremely foolish.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is exactly right, and he might have added to his catalogue of failures of the economics profession, failing to see the financial crisis. But I think it is time for economists to re-examine their methods for the reasons which I indicated earlier, and I'm grateful to him for putting on record past failures.
Heidi Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the leaked government analysis confirms that realistically there are 3 ways that the UK might leave the EU, each with a very different impact upon jobs, trade and livelihoods, why haven't MPs been given a direct vote at the start of the process to determine what sort of Brexit the UK is pursuing? Isn't it about time that in this House we are allowed to take back common sense and seek the sensible option of staying in the single market by staying in the European Economic Area and remaining part of a European customs union?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, she's entirely wrong. The sensible and pragmatic way forward, which honours the result of the referendum, which ensures that this is a democracy with an independent parliament, able to ensure that control is exercised over the laws of this country, the sensible thing to do is to carry forward my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister's policy, as she's set out in Florence and in the Lancaster House speech.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
It's about time we set up a charity called Soothsayers Anonymous for people who simply can't kick the habit of predicting when conflicts are going to break out, when we're going to have opinion polls that are going to be accurate, and when we're going to have economic forecasts regarding the EU that are going to be accurate, even though history has shown time and time again that they're not worth the paper they're written on.
Mr. Speaker, makes a very good point, but I'm not sure that we will make it government policy to do it.
Lady Herman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be well aware that Sinn Féin has already used the Brexit decision to agitate for a border poll. I would say to the British Government they need to be really very careful indeed that Sinn Féin does not use any more negative impact assessments to feed their narrative. So, in those circumstances, what guarantees could the Minister offer the people of Northern Ireland today that the economy will not suffer as a result of Brexit? We must make sure not to feed Sinn Féin's narrative.
Well, Minister. Of course, the Honourable Lady makes a sobering and important point, which the Government has heard. What I would say to her is that, again, as in all scenarios in this economic analysis, there is economic growth. The question is only how fast, and of course it is the task of this Government to ensure that we achieve the fastest GDP growth, and indeed the fastest GDP growth per head, which is why we've brought forward a comprehensive programme around productivity. And of course we're most concerned to ensure the prosperity of the people, not only of Northern Ireland, but of the whole of the island of Ireland, and right across the prosperity of people right across Europe. And that's why it's in our mutual interest to agree a comprehensive and deep free trade agreement.
Stephen Crabb.
Speaker, even though these forecasts don't look at the government's preferred outcome, wouldn't my honourable friend agree that the data that they contain, however imperfectly, do underline the importance of building a bespoke deal around maintaining customs union-style arrangements and ensuring as great as access as possible to the single market?
Minister.
Well, I agree with him in most of his points, Mr. Speaker, but as I said in an earlier answer, we don't think it would be the right thing to do to remain within the customs union so that the European Union set our tariffs on imports. We think that that would be the wrong choice for the United Kingdom. It would prevent us from operating an independent trade policy and plugging ourselves into the rest of the world's growth, whereas multiple authorities, including the European Commission, have admitted 90% of the world's growth will come from. So on that particular point I disagree with him, but on the rest of his arguments, and in particular the need in our mutual interests for a good quality trade agreement, of course on that point he's right and I agree.
Pat McFadden.
Ministers keep using the excuse that it's in the national interest to withhold information about the economic impact of Brexit. That is on the days when they admit that such information exists. Yeah. But I'll tell you what's really not patriotic, and that is to pursue a policy that will make your country poorer than it would otherwise be in order to satisfy right-wing nationalist ideology. So will the Minister desist from saying that it's in the national interest to withhold this information when the only interest it serves is Tory ministers embarrassed by its contents?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I simply do not accept the premises of his question. I think he's made ludicrous suggestions. I consider myself an old English liberal, and I think most of the Eurosceptics with whom I associate also consider themselves liberal in outlook, particularly in relation to matters of trade and the economy. And so with that in mind, I can't possibly accept the premise that he has made. The fact is, we are in a negotiation, and no one seriously would expect us to go into... he says, wash my mouth out. I'm happy to debate liberalism with him any time. Mr. Speaker, we are heading for an open, liberal, free-trading future for the United Kingdom, and any suggestion of nationalism is quite wrong, quite ludicrous, and he should retract.
One member for Carshalton and Wallington rather looks as though he's just consumed a very bitter lemon, but I hope he recovers. I hope the right honourable gentleman recovers. Mr. Philip Hollowbone.
Does my honourable friend the Minister share my dismay that pro-Remain members of this House who represent constituencies who voted to leave leap on incomplete economic analysis and profess deep understanding of complex economic methodology, yet fail to wrap their minds around the simple arithmetic of the referendum, which was that 52% voted to leave?
Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I must exercise some caution because, as you will know, Wickham District, which is substantially larger than Wickham constituency, did express the other view. But what I think we need to do is to come together and to unite around the result as a country and to choose for ourselves, not to leave the European Union because we must, not to leave the European Union because we ought, but to leave the European Union successfully because we choose to abide by the democratic decision of the United Kingdom as a whole.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How can we unite together with this when this side of the House is withholding information from the rest of the House?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's very difficult to answer the question of how we could unite together when certain members of this House, including, I'm sorry to say, the Honourable Lady, keep provoking as much division as possible. I would ask her, as they represent a party claiming to be liberal and democratic, they represent a party which once offered a real referendum on Europe. Well, Mr. Speaker, we've had a real referendum on Europe, and it's time for the Honourable Lady to get behind the result.
Marcus Jones.
Speaker, the gloomy post-referendum Treasury forecast led many of us to
vote Remain with a heavy heart. The public made their decision. We stood on election manifesto saying that we'd follow through that decision. Can the Minister tell me why we should believe part forecasts, because these forecasts that have apparently been published are not complete, when the initial information put out before the referendum was flawed?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he makes a very good point, and Project Fear was mentioned earlier. It is most unfortunate one of the fundamental tactics always used throughout the long and sorry history of misrepresenting the true purpose of the European Union has been to demoralise the public. It is time for each of us in this House to take a lead in going forward in a spirit of buoyancy and hope.
The Minister wouldn't accept the premise of the question from my honourable friend for Wolverhampton, but this morning we heard from the former Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, the honourable member for Chingford, and he cast significant doubt on the government's own ability to forecast the impact of Brexit on jobs and growth. What assurances will the Minister give to workers in my constituency, for example in the Jaguar Land Rover supply chain or the Vauxhall supply chain, that Brexit will not fatally wound the manufacturing sector on Merseyside?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I think the record will show, I've said multiple times, in all scenarios in this economic analysis, growth is forecast. Growth is forecast. It's good news for the honourable lady, and it's good news for the country that in all of the forecast, in all of the circumstances of the economic analysis, growth is forecast. But I'd also say to her, she brings up the issue of the supply chain. Of course we are appraised of the imperatives of complex international supply chains, not just between the UK and Europe, but around the whole world. But in particular, I draw attention to provisions in the Union Custom Code for inward and outward processing rules, which should assist manufacturers in her.
Richard Bacon.
Mr. Speaker, were the economists involved in these forecasts the same ones who said we'd lose 500,000 jobs if people voted for Brexit, when in fact since the referendum we've gained 350,000 jobs?
Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm not able to give him exactly that information. I would say that perhaps some are. But what I would say to him is that in my experience, civil servants at all levels dutifully carry out the instructions of the government, and I'm sure in this case that they are doing that.
Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It might surprise the Minister, but I have read a number of his articles, and whilst there's much in them which I disagree with, he talks a lot about liberty, accountability, transparency and democracy, but he doesn't seem to like any of those principles when they're applied to him and his government, and when they shed light on the reckless course that his government is pursuing. If the government has not done a full and comprehensive analysis, then they're incompetent. If they have done it, we should see it.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I announced at the beginning of my initial response, the government will make available to both Houses of Parliament the appropriate economic analysis before we make a decision on the meaningful vote.
Heidi Allen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. No one in this House should dismiss the result of the referendum. I believe that would be overstepping the mark. But it is our role, as accepted by government, to scrutinise the deal to ensure it is the very best it can be for all our citizens, regardless of how or if indeed they voted in the referendum. The impact assessments were made available for parliamentarians in absolute confidentiality. I went to see them. I therefore fail to see why this same process cannot be extended for this and any further analysis. This is a one-time deal only, and I, for one, owe it to my constituents to prove to them that I have exercised full scrutiny.
Well, Minister, I can't accept the premise of a question, because we've gone to and fro in this House about the meaning of the term impact assessments. What was made available to colleagues was sectoral analysis, and as I've referred to both to our written ministerial statement, which sets out how meaningful votes will happen at the end of the process, and I would also refer to my previous remarks about protecting the integrity of our negotiating position and ensuring that parliamentarians, when we reach the end of the negotiating period, are able to have access to appropriate economic analysis when we all take that important decision.
Wes Streeting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I asked the Treasury's Permanent Secretary if he could confirm that just a single one of the government scenarios for a deal post-Brexit would lead to a better outcome, better economic deal than the one we have with a single market and the customs union. He didn't seem able to answer. Isn't the truth that no such model exists. And isn't it confirmed today that as a result of the government's dogmatic determination to pull us out of the single market and the customs union, it won't be my city of London that's most impacted, or indeed the industries in the City of London that are worst affected. It will be key sectors of our economy right across the UK, with the impact felt in the West Midlands, the North East, and Northern Ireland the worst. How on earth could that possibly be in the national interest?
Mr. Speaker, he asked, is it the case, as he said, that there's no such model. The truth is that a model was referred to earlier by my honourable friend. I mean, economists for free trade are very clear about their modelling. Other models are available. Open Europe at the time of the referendum looked at modelling, and they found it could be plus or minus 2%. The truth is, Mr. Speaker, that there are profound uncertainties facing not just the United Kingdom through this negotiation, but all economies in the world face three big problems, or three big issues: the growth of technology, a new phase in globalisation, and of course the continuing aftermath of the financial crisis, which leaves us, as he well knows, the Governor of the Bank of England described interest rates as being at extraordinary, if not emergency levels. Those three issues mean that all economies are on highly uncertain paths. The government will navigate its way through this future with confidence and boldness.
Charlie Elphick.
Mr. Speaker, is the Minister aware that in the last 40 years the European Union's share of global GDP has fallen from 30% to just 15%, and that future world economic growth, 90% of it, is going to come from outside Europe? Does he agree that the future is not regional relative decline, but the future is global?
I do agree, Mr. Speaker, and I think he makes an extremely good point. What we need to do is make sure that this country is well positioned. He refers to the previous era of globalisation, and particularly the emergence of China. The task of the United Kingdom is to take the right strategic decisions so that we can be plugged in not only to Asia, but also, I very much hope, to an emerging Africa, to Latin America, to the whole world, and that we can participate on the basis of technologies which were unimaginable at the beginning of the life of the European Union, not least the internet, inexpensive air travel and containerised shipping. Those three things have transformed our world for the better, and I hope and expect, as I am sure he does, that in the future, over the course of our lifetimes, the world also will improve in ways we cannot yet imagine.
Emma Reynolds.
We learned today that the government's own analysis suggests that our economy will grow by less than 5% in the case of a UK-EU trade deal. That is people's jobs and livelihoods. Can he confirm, therefore, that the government's negotiating position has been decided not on the basis of the economic evidence, but on ideology alone?
Well, Mr. Speaker, let's not pretend there's no ideology amongst those who wish to remain in the European Union, even at the cost of overturning a democratic decision, even at the cost of remaining in the EEA and surrendering democratic control of political power. The figure to which she refers is wrong. It's not as she has stated, but I don't propose now to walk through what is in this analysis, which, as I've said before, is at this point at a provisional stage draft and is not yet government policy.
Simon Clark.
Mr. Speaker, on Friday the Brexit Secretary was on Teesside to set out an optimistic free trading vision for the UK after we leave, and given that all estimates have consistently underestimated our economy, surely it's time just to get on with the job.
Minister. Mr. Speaker, it is time to get on with the job, and I would pay tribute to him and his colleagues for the brilliant work they've done in agitated for free trade zones, which I believe should be an important part of the government's consideration.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister is clearly making himself out to be a bit of a philosopher today, I would just ask him I would just say to him, surely it's the mark of a democracy that those of us that take different sides do not question each other's patriotism. And with that in mind, can I ask the Minister to take the sensible decision, as the previous Chancellor George Osborne did, which is to get these forecasts out of the Treasury. If he doesn't trust them, get these forecasts out of the Treasury and say to the OBR, by the time of the spring statement, you do the forecast, and then we can all see what the truth is.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think I've been quite careful not to use the word patriotism and not to question it, but I think the voters of the United Kingdom are entitled to look at the words and actions of their parliamentarians and ask themselves, what are they trying to achieve? Are they committed to obeying, to adhering to the referendum result? Are they doing it with a spirit of confidence and boldness? Are they doing it with with buoyancy and hope, or are they trying to demoralise the public and overturn the result through delay and revocation? And I think the honourable lady will need to think very carefully about what her voters, and indeed all of our voters, will think about our actions, and I hope that she will commit to carrying through the democratic decision.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What is in the national interest, Mr. Speaker, is that we get the best deal we possibly can. And would my honourable friend agree with me that to do that, we have to keep our cards close to our chest? These are tough negotiations. To expose the goods and the bads in such negotiations plays right into the hand of an organisation that, let's face it, doesn't want us to leave anyway.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think their willingness to see us leave is increasing by the day as we go down through this process. And I think it is important that the House knows that important figures across the European Union pay close attention to our newspaper headlines. And I think it's important and incumbent on all of us that we remain committed in that spirit of buoyancy and hope to carrying through the referendum result. I'm grateful for his question.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker. We've been here before, of course, because the same gloom-laden forecasts were made before the referendum, and none of them were anywhere near the mark. Would he agree with me that these long-term forecasts are as useful in predicting future economic performance as newspaper horoscopes? But more importantly, will he give us an assurance that despite the hysteria from these benches, the government will not be distracted from honouring its commitment to delivering the United Kingdom out of the single market and out of the customs union?
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker, and he reminds me of the great economist Galbraith, who I think said, if I recall correctly, that the only purpose of economic forecasting was to make astrology look respectable, and I think there's a great deal of truth in that.
Jeremy Lefroy.
And another great economist, J.M. Keynes, said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? Would my honourable friend confirm that a deep and special partnership includes services as well as goods, because this is 80% of our economy, and that any deal without all services would not be a deal that is in the interest of the United Kingdom?
Well, of course I would agree with him, Mr. Speaker, about the importance of services, but I'd go further, and I think it's extremely important that our Ambassador to the World Trade Organisation, Julian Braithwaite, is chairing the relevant committee on services, and I think it's in the UK's interest, indeed in the world's interests, that we take part in a global liberalisation of services in trade. I think that is key to unlocking the prosperity of the United Kingdom, indeed key to unlocking the capacity of governments to meet the commitments that they have entered into for their populations.
Mr. Andrew Slaughter.
Speaker, my constituents, many of them former Conservative voters, cannot understand why any government would adopt policies that knowingly made them or the country worse off. Today, the Minister's tactic is to rubbish his own commissioned analyses because they show leaving the EU is an economic disaster to a greater or lesser extent. If he believes in Brexit at any cost, will he at least have the honesty to say so?
Mr. Speaker, that's just simply not the case, as I think I've not hesitated to say several times. This economic analysis does not show the country being worse off. It shows the country being better off under all circumstances. It shows GDP growing. It shows he says it's nonsense, Mr. Speaker. I can assure him it's not nonsense. In all circumstances, it shows GDP growth growing. It shows GDP increasing. The point of the government's policy must be to carry through faithfully the decision of the British people, and to do so in a way which proves these doommongers and naysayers wrong.
Mr. Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In these negotiations, the UK is one side and 27 other governments, and the EU is on the other. Would he confirm to me how many of those governments and the EU itself has confirmed they'll publish the entirety of their internal analysis on each option they might be prepared to opt for?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, Mr. Speaker, because I'm not aware of any of them preparing to reveal that information. He's absolutely right to raise it, but I can assure him that I've given instructions to our teams that they are to analyse the interests of other member states, simply for the purpose of demonstrating that it is in all of our mutual interests to conclude a deep and special partnership.
There's so much noise, I think I'll call someone who's been behaving in a statesperson-like manner. Fiona Onasanya.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to say to the Minister that I refute that accusation that we do not accept what our constituents have voted for. When they were asked in June, they were asked a simple question like, would you like a divorce, yes or no? They answered that question, but they didn't know who would have the children, who gets the house, how the assets would be split. So what we're asking for is to give us the detail of the impact that you have done the analysis for, so that we can advise our constituents how leaving will affect them.
Minister. Mr. Speaker, she makes a very interesting point, but I slightly regret the metaphor. I think what we need to face up to here is that the British public have rejected the idea of delivering free trade through political integration. Our task is to rise up to the challenge of this new decision in strategic political economy and deliver free trade which provides for democratic control of political power. I did listen carefully to what she said.
Simon Hoare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's with growing admiration that I listen to the pronouncements of the mystic Meggs and indeed the mystic Moggs, who with near papal infallibility pronounce this, that or the other as being absolute certainty. I agree with the Minister when he says that this is an uncertain process. All my constituents and my businesses in North Dorset want to hear from the Minister is that he and the government are committed to a pragmatic, common-sense solution to this issue which we are facing into, to ensure economic growth, stability in jobs and prosperity in Dorset.
Absolutely. Minister. I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and as I said in an earlier question, I believe that pragmatic way forward is as set out by our right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, in the Lancaster House and the Florence speeches, and I'm grateful to him for underlining that it's the right way that it is the right way forward.
Mr. Barry Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, how dare the Minister suggest to my constituents that ignorance is bliss? My constituents were misled by the lies on the side of the Brexit bus. My constituents are now being deprived of the information that suggests that up and down the north of England, and Yorkshire in particular, jobs, employment will plunge if we go out on the bus with worse terms. Will he apologise to my constituents for misleading them?
Well, Mr. Speaker, no, I won't, because what I'd encourage him to do is to listen to the arguments that I've made and to the answers that I've given. In all scenarios in this analysis, economic growth increases. But what I'd also say to him, he talks about people being misled in the referendum campaign. There were two campaigns, they're both susceptible to criticism, and I would encourage him to have a look at the House of Commons Treasury Committee's report, which criticised the Remain campaign quite heavily, otherwise I should not have been able to sign up to it.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my Chelmsford constituency, over 2,000 people work in insurance. Britain is home to the world's largest insurance market, and many European companies need access to our market. Does the Minister agree with me that it is in both Britain and Europe's interest to seek a much deeper and more modern trade relationship than that which the EU has with any other third country?
Mr. Speaker, I would agree with her. The United Kingdom has a comparative advantage in insurance, as in so many financial services. I think it's, as I indicated earlier, in the interests of Europe and the world that we should be able to take that comparative advantage and put it to the service of the whole world.
A lot of it will be genuine.
Albert Owen.
Mr. Speaker, like the right honourable gentleman from Preseli, Pembrokeshire, who's no longer in his place, my constituency is the gateway to Britain from the Republic of Ireland, and on the front line of Brexit. Businesses that I've spoken to in the last few weeks and months want to know, because of the uncertainty, analysis of what Brexit is going to mean to them specifically. Can the Minister tell the House when he was intending to share this information with local authorities, devolved administration, and indeed their MP, who needs to keep them informed?
Mr. Speaker, I can tell the honourable gentleman that my honourable friend for Worcester has been in contact with the Port of Holyhead, and we will continue our programme of engagement, well appraised of the need to keep talking with businesses, particularly those businesses who provide our important infrastructure, like the port in his constituency. What he asked me when, what I've said is that before the meaningful vote, we will make appropriate economic analysis available to the House.
Hugh Merriman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During referendum week, I was fortunate to speak to 25 schools, having taken a neutral position. I visited 2 schools in the last fortnight, and the vast majority of those students, even though they would have voted to remain, wanted to get on with the job rather than unpick it. Would the Minister agree with me that it's essential that we respect the ballot box that elected us and engage more with our constituents and get on with the job in hand?
Mr. Speaker, I would agree with him, and I particularly would lament the way that so much demoralisation has taken place aimed at young people. It is precisely because we are concerned for their futures that we want to deliver a successful partnership with the European Union as we turn out to take advantage of that growth when 90% of it will come from the rest of the world. It is their future we're concerned for, and it's their future which led people like me to campaign for leave on the basis of upholding their democratic choice to choose a government and influence its policies.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker, these leaked figures indicate and expose the damage that will be caused by a Brexit outside the single market and the customs union. Isn't it the case that the greatest failure of this Parliament on the biggest issue of our times, and despite the damage to people's livelihoods and standards of living, the British Government and the Labour opposition share the exact same position?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've already said, all scenarios in this analysis show growth, and they're also the analysis is heavily caveated with the uncertainties, the profound uncertainties which exist not only for the UK and Europe but for the world. And I think in that context, I hope he will accept the answers that I have given him today.
Michael Tomlinson.
On from that, isn't it right that we should approach such economic modelling with caution? History has proved them to be wrong and flawed in the past. The information is incomplete. And does my honourable friend and philosopher long-standing look forward to proving this analysis wrong as well?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would agitate for a healthy scepticism about the use of mathematical economics, and I think we should go forward in that spirit.
Lillian Greenwood.
Mr. Speaker, what duty does the Minister owe to the British people, including my constituents, if not to tell the truth about the choices in the negotiations before us and what they will mean for jobs and businesses in Nottingham?
Mr. Speaker, I think that over the long course of the history of the European Union, and indeed in the course of the referendum campaign, people have not shown a particular willingness on a very wide scale to engage in the details of trade policy. I think this is an area where they do expect the government. She says about our duty. Our duty is to get on with the job that they have given us to do, not only in answering the referendum question telling us that they wish to leave the EU, but in voting at the general election for a range of parties, all of whom, including our own, said we should leave the European Union. And to leave the European Union, we need to leave the customs union, we need to leave the EEA, and we need to restore democratic control of political power. And that is what we're going to do. That is our duty.
Tom Burskelav.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The naysayers who are talking this up are some of the same people who said that on the 24th of June we would drop off a cliff, that exports would be down, foreign direct investment would be down, jobs would be lost. The list goes on, and the opposite is true. Does my honourable friend agree with me that it won't always be plain sailing, there will be difficulties along the way, but the end destination is worth getting to, and that people up and down this country in increasing numbers are just saying, get on with it?
I will agree with him, Mr. Speaker. We do need to get on with it, and yes, the end destination is worth it going to, although hopefully there will be no end to this journey. We will journey out into a new life of prosperity and self-government, which will give us the dignity of self-control.
Phoebe Perkins.
Mr. Speaker, first to draw the attention of the House to my register of interest concerning Waitron Belanchai. I have here a letter sent by the European Commission that was received by British manufacturing firms telling them that after Brexit all products certified for use by UK certifiers will no longer be eligible for sale in the EU. These companies are now rushing to get their entire product range recertified, often at 3 times the cost from European certifying authorities. So what advice does the government give to UK manufacturing firms who have products certified in the UK about what they should do in the run-up to Brexit and the need for recertification?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I expect us to conclude a free trade agreement with the European Union, which includes agreements in relation to product conformity, and I hope that we will make rapid progress through these negotiations now that we've made sufficient progress and we're moving on to the next stage. And I very much hope that everyone in this country, including manufacturers to whom he refers, will be given an accelerating degree of certainty as we progress through those negotiations.
Mike Wood.
Is my honourable friend familiar with the PwC analysis, which suggests that the UK could be the fastest growing economy in the G7 between Brexit and 2050?
I'm extremely grateful to him for pointing that out. Thank you.
Joe Platt.
Thank you,
you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware I have submitted over 23 questions to his department asking what assessments the government has undertaken, all to ensure businesses and workers in my area are safeguarded. The government has repeatedly refused to release even the titles of these assessments. So could the Minister confirm the number of impact studies the government has conducted and how long he expects members to have access to these documents before we vote on the final Brexit deal?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the documents that we've put out and discussed at great length, I think, continue to be available to colleagues. But what I've said is that, in relation to the subject at hand today, the economic analysis, we will, as I've said, put before both houses the appropriate economic analysis before the decision is taken.
Drew Hendry.
Speaker, you'll recall from this morning that the Bayes Minister ducked my question on the impact of these assessments on small businesses. So I'll try again. Does the Minister, if he's leaked or not, willing to be disparaging about his own civil servants producing his own reports, does he also reject the reports from St Andrews University, pointing out that small business will be hit by lower levels of investment, access to finance, lower growth and reduced product development opportunities?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd make 2 points to him. One, as far as I recall, I've never been disparaging about civil servants with whom I've worked. Quite the reverse. What I've been disparaging about is method in the economic sciences, which is quite different. But what I'd say to him, once more, is that all of the circumstances in this analysis predict growth, and I refer him to the answer I gave early on, pointing out all the flaws in the predictions of the Bank of England. And I would ask him to start working out how he can play his part in leading this country forward with a spring in its step.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I begin by referring Parliament to my declaration in the Register of Interest. In the past week, both Jaguar Land Rover and Mark Carney have blamed the falling growth and their business, respectively, on Brexit. For Jaguar Land Rover, this is resulting in prolonged shutdowns and declining production. This is now. Will the Minister accept the reality of what's happening and publish its analyses?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I would accept is that Jaguar Land Rover does not sell as many cars as I should like them to see, and I think consider it the duty of this government to enter into trading arrangements with the whole world which facilitate their complete success. And I look forward to working to do just that with all the strength we can muster.
Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, if work has been done on the regional impact of different Brexit scenarios, isn't it in the national interest that regional devolved bodies and also local councils have this information so they can make appropriate plans for the future?
Mr. Speaker, we will continue our programme of engagements with the devolved assemblies, Parliament, and also with the English regions. But what we will not do is publish information which we consider is prejudicial to their interests and the national interest by revealing information which would harm our negotiations.
Alex Cunningham.
Mr. Speaker, the information in today's government report directly reflects what industries and businesses on Teesside have been saying for months, that they'll suffer if the government totally abandons the single market and the customs union. Ministers may choose to ignore the reports, but will they please listen to the industrialists and the business people, listen to what they're saying, be open and honest about the impacts and provide clarity on how they can trade successfully after Brexit?
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State only just went to the region last week to make an important speech about the implementation period, precisely because we understand their importance. And there's no question of us ignoring analysis. We're conducting the analysis in order to inform our positions, as I think I've tirelessly set out.
Anna McMorrin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is about the UK government doing its job, and they've spectacularly failed to do that. This leaked paper talks about the impact of Brexit on different areas of the UK, and despite telling devolved governments and administrations that they have nothing, and he failed to answer this question to my honourable friends. So when will this information be shared with the devolved administrations so that they can make decisions on behalf of the people that they represent and govern?
Well, Minister, Speaker, we will make available information once we are through the negotiation, so that we don't end up putting ourselves in the position of publishing information which is prejudicial to the national interest. So I would expect that information to be published and in particular made available to both Houses of Parliament once the negotiations have concluded and before the meaningful vote.
Madeline Moon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Why does this Conservative government not trust the voters of Bridgend, many of whom rely on the Ford engine plant for their jobs? It's acknowledged that car manufacturing will be one of the areas hardest hit. The Minister says there's going to be growth. Then let the people of Bridgend know where the growth is going to be and what better growth could be achieved by staying in the single market. Or is the Minister more interested in healing the wounds within the Conservative Party than looking after the people of Bridgend?
Speaker, what I'm interested in is healing the wounds across the whole country and getting people to unite behind a democratic decision and take it forward. It's precisely because we do trust the voters, Mr. Speaker, because we do trust the voters, that not only do we want to carry through the referendum result, but we want to ensure our parliamentary independence so that when the voters vote, they can materially affect the policy choices of a government.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. I'm concerned about some of the recent answers. Would the Minister confirm what damage will happen to the UK's negotiating position if this analysis is shared with the devolved governments?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that the honourable gentleman can easily find a wide range of literature which explain how to do a negotiation. But what one does not do when going into a negotiation is place one's cards face up on the table, and we're not going to do it.
Order. Thank you. Yes, I think this point of order relates to the subject matter we've been discussing, so I'll take it now. Point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the past 6 weeks, and again further to the question that I have just asked, I have tabled 23 written questions to the Department for Exiting the European Union and the Treasury, which ask for the titles of any assessments the Government have conducted on the impact of our withdrawal from the European Union. However, none of these questions have been adequately answered. What I have received has been very vague, often ignored, and ministers have not provided me with the information I requested. Without any obvious avenue to turn, I therefore seek your guidance, Mr. Speaker, as to how I can secure an answer from ministers to the questions I have asked in order for me to ascertain the titles and number of assessments the Government has undertaken.
Well, I thank the honourable member for giving me notice of her intended point of order. I'm not at all sure that I can offer her much satisfaction or comfort, but what I will say is as follows. The content of ministerial answers to parliamentary questions is the responsibility of the minister concerned. It is not and cannot be a matter for the chair. I can understand her dissatisfaction with the answers that she has received. I'm afraid that it is not uncommon for answers from successive governments of different complexions to fail to engage either fully or in some cases at all with the question in the view of the recipient of the answer, or indeed to do so only vaguely. However, I advise the honourable member to persist and to discuss with the Table Office what other avenues she might pursue. I must emphasise, on the basis of some little experience in the House, the merits of quantity, persistence, and above all, repetition. Members must, if I may very politely say so, keep at it. And I remember one year tabling, I think, a little under 4,000 questions, which somewhat irritated ministers at the time, which caused me no concern whatsoever. I was simply concerned to table the questions that mattered to me, and if that caused some inconvenience to other people, that was really besides the point. Democracy costs. The honourable lady asks for clarification on whether members will be granted access to analytical studies on the impact of the UK's withdrawal from the EU ahead of any vote on the final deal. I do not know the answer to that question beyond what we've heard from the Minister today, and the Minister has said some things today on which members can reflect. If she feels that she wants to put further questions on this matter to ministers, it's open to her to do so. On the question of whether it's in order for ministers or government departments to show information to journalists before providing it to the House, I would say that while this is not a matter of order, it would certainly represent a discourtesy to members, and I would deprecate that. I hope that ministers will reflect on the matter and consider what information should be provided to the House at all stages on this important matter. I hope that is helpful to the honourable lady.